Hello, welcome to the special episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. I am one of your co-hosts, Katherine Troyer, and I'm so excited because we get to have a special interview with the one and only Carson Winter. Hi, Carson.
Hey, how's it going? Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Before the episode, before we started recording, I was just sort of gushing about you as a horror writer. I just dig everything that you're doing, and so it's just so neat to get to talk to you and to talk specifically about your upcoming soft targets, which is really mind-blowing in lots of ways.
Aw, shucks. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for writing as prolifically as you do too. I feel like you're always producing something which is much faster than my writing time of like a draft of something in 10 years. So I also appreciate just your constant coming up with these great ideas that haunt me.
I try to be like a shark and just keep moving forward. That's just how it works for me, but it's also one of those things. I know, like, all writing advice out there to me, I think is slightly bullshit depending on who it applies to. There's I work with like great writers who are totally the slow and steady types. They make work I admire, and it's incredible. There's lots of ways to do it. There's no right way. I happen to be in the lane where I got to keep moving and doing something. But there's a lot of amazing work out there that's produced the opposite way to figure out what you like to do and do it.
Well, as a reader, it just means that I get to have more of your writing faster. So I'm that's the right way, right? More Carson Winter is the correct way. Uh, before we
Trying to
get
saturate the market on Carson.
you should. That's
Pure
what I mean.
saturation.
People should be like, my gosh, look at how much of my bookshelf is just Carson Winter.
That's right.
Before we get started on our questions, would you, mainly because I can't seem to say the press's name correctly, would you give people the details they need to be able to find soft targets? Because right now, as of like into February, if you search on Amazon, even soft targets with your name, it just pulls up literal shooting targets. Right? So what do people need to do to be able to find your novella?
So first off, I believe Tenebrous Press, that's who's publishing Soft Targets. It comes out on March 22nd. I believe they mostly do all of their sales through their website.
Good
I
for
don't, I
them.
don't, I don't actually know if they even do Amazon at all, which I think is kind of cool. And
Awesome.
they're just incredible publishers in the indie press world. Working with them has been wonderful. But like the amount of work they put into their marketing and being able to get those sales even while not using, some of these bigger distribution platforms. And I talked to Matt, and we kind of have a enviable setup right now in that we live just across the river from each other. I'm
Oh,
I'm the
that's neat.
first I'm the first author signing, I think, that's just in the Portland area. So, I mean, we get to do kind of cool, fun stuff where he orders a bunch of books, I can sign them, and he
That's
can send
cool.
them out. But yeah, Soft Targets, March 22nd through Tenebrous Press. It is a story with that deals with some tough topics, a lot of gun violence, mass violence. You're an American, you probably know all about this, dear listener, unfortunately. But yeah, content warnings are up front on the website, so definitely decide if it's for you. It's not an easy book, and I definitely won't be upset at anyone opting out for sure. It's just, make sure it's for you.
I think that's a great sort of warning because it is a wonderful, wonderful book. But as someone that grew up not far from Columbine, as I was telling you, and had my school closed down for that shooting, it's definitely it resonates right with where we are in America, where we shouldn't be, but where we are. So that's nice that you all have the sort of warnings of just what to expect in terms of content.
Yeah, and that was actually part of kind of the deal with this book. We can get into it a little bit later, but they passed on it initially.
Wow.
Yeah, and but they came back. They came back to me like 6 months later, and they're like, you know what? We can't get this one out of our heads. We want to do this. I think we're ready for it now, but part of that is, are you comfortable with like content warnings being a big part of, the promotional drive? Like that's going to be attached to your book. That's going to be everywhere. And for me, I was like, it's a no-brainer. Of course. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. That's terrific. So we're going to start with one of my favorite like icebreaker type questions, because I just always feel that the answers tell me so much about a person. So the question is, if you could taste any intangible thing, and it could be intangible because either it's lacking in form or it's imaginary, but if you could taste any intangible thing, what would you want to taste and why?
Okay. I admit this one was like a tough one.
I know, it's my favorite.
Yeah, when I first looked at the question, I was like, oh fuck, what is that? But then I realized like, oh no, it reveals something about me that I almost don't want to share, which is
Oh my
how
gosh, I'm so
corny
excited.
I am. This is very John Lennon of me, but I think like what I'd want to taste is like the absence of anxiety.
Oh, that's lovely.
Like just pure calm, unadulterated calm.
That's nice. Oh, I bet it tastes so good.
Yes. 2 scoops, please.
Yes. I think I would want to taste imagination, because I feel like it'd be
Oh,
an intriguing taste. But I think that's only because I feel like imagination would also be the lack of anxiety, right? So like it
yeah.
would just have the undertones of no concern about the future and about my place in it and all that stuff. Oh, I
I feel
like that.
imagination would be like a very rich and layered taste. It would be you would have a lot to talk about with it. I feel like a lot
You
to share.
would. You would. Whereas like even though you're describing the lack of something, I feel like it would have a very distinct taste, right? The lack of
Yeah.
anxiety. And
Hmm.
it'd be that thing that you're like, I'm ready to relax, to have a couple scoops and
Yeah.
then watch some TV. Like that would be such a good taste. Oh, that was a fantastic answer. I ask my students that every semester, and I get lots of joys and hopes, because apparently all my students are like really kind, wonderful people. And then every so often someone will put like darkness or like the taste of someone's soul. And I'm like, these are the people I probably identify with more. But I think your answer takes the win for now. And I think it also makes sense when you think about your canon of work, right? That these are themes that keep coming up. All of your primary characters have this anxiety driving them in different ways. So that's
Yeah, they
interesting.
do for sure. I think anxiety in the horror genre is has a very long history. I always think back, like to the Telltale Heart and stuff. Of course, that character's anxiety is a little bit different than mine. I think he very much well earned his
Yeah.
anxiety.
Yeah, I'm glad that you made that distinction. You're like that. This is not where my anxiety lies,
Yeah, exactly.
because that would be disturbing. Yeah, but Haunting of Hill House, I mean, is grounded in that idea of
Yes.
anxiety, and there's just so many great texts that are doing
I,
that.
I would say The Haunting of Hill House to me is like the definitive anxiety tale.
Yes,
It's
yes,
just everything about it. It so perfectly mimics too kind of that social anxiety you get, where I feel like the horror doesn't come through like ghosts, it just comes through like the changing tones in conversation, where suddenly
yes.
people are like really jolly and friendly and welcoming, and suddenly they're like kind of like, oh, kind of being like a little accusing or ding, and it's almost like this chill wind just sweeps through a scene, but nothing's really different. It's just
No.
it's just people talking, but it's scary, it's frightening.
Yes. Yeah, the grounds people always crack me up with their line of like, but we don't come at night. But really, Hill House is not the scary thing. I think you're right that it's that idea of being in such an intimate situation with absolute strangers.
Hmm.
Uh, and that makes for interesting things that are happening with, I don't know if you saw the Netflix adaptation where, grounds it in this family, but it's also a family of people who don't know each other anymore, right? So that comes up a lot.
I'm like one of the few people who just could not stand the Netflix. I know, right? Like
Yeah,
I feel I am so out of step with everyone else, but I was almost enraged by it. But
interesting.
and I think it's because of my like connection with the source material. The things
Yeah,
I like about it I felt like just weren't present in the show as far as tone.
yeah,
And I also felt there was a little insulting to me that so much of the story's style and like filmic language I felt were lifted more from, Blumhouse and Stephen King than
Hmm.
really feeling specifically Jacksonian.
Hmm.
Um, but I feel like if I divorced it entirely from the source material, I can see what people have connected to for sure. But I always have it in the back of my mind like this just does not feel like the atmosphere of the book to me.
No, no, I definitely treat it as a text that just happens to have the same name because it's not a Gothic text, right? In the same way that Jackson builds for us in everything that she
Yeah.
delivers. I think you're very correct that it's to describe it as more Blumhouse and feel is spot on. My students are about to watch it and read the book for my adaptation class that I'm teaching, and I'll be intrigued to see their thoughts because many of them have only seen the Netflix show and they
Oh,
haven't ever
okay.
read the book. And we're going to like split it up where they're going to start watching the show and then we'll read the book and then they'll finish the show. So I'm intrigued to know if like people's opinions will change depending on how they experience the two in relationship with one another. Because like you, right, I read the book first,
Hmm.
and it's hard to divorce the two.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest differences too is that like the show, um potentially to its credit, not necessarily to me, but a lot of people I think responded well to this, is that the show feels a lot more warmer. Like it has that feeling of genuine human connections, people who care about each other.
Yes.
Where the book feels a lot chillier to me.
Yes.
It's everyone's kind of a little bit at arm's length, and like there's sometimes hints of warmth, but it's fleeting. It comes and goes. It's almost like a weapon in and of itself. Um, so I'd actually be really interested to hear what your students think too.
Yeah, I'll be excited. It's interesting that you describe that being an appeal for you in Jackson's text because I think you can see that that type of relationship in Soft Targets, right, between Ollie and our narrator, where it's a dysfunctional relationship as much as it is the sort of definitive relationship for these two individuals. So that's interesting. I can see why you might lean more towards Jackson, having read so much of your stuff.
Oh yeah, totally. And that's a really good comparison too. I wouldn't have thought of that, but totally it does show up.
What? You wouldn't just automatically compare yourself to Shirley Jackson? You have to have the hubris.
Yeah.
Uh, so I mean, Haunting of Hill House is a good example, but what are like some texts, cinematic, literary, game based, that you recommend for horror creators who are really wanting to better understand the genre, how to create in the genre? Like these are the texts that you say before you start writing. Maybe you should watch these. What would some of those texts be?
Oh geez. I mean, I think there's so many for one, and you can
Yeah.
go in a lot of different directions too, because, I kind of speak as a weird fiction writer. My influences are going to be a little bit different than someone who is like earnestly pursuing, splatterpunk or something. But for me, like I think it's important to have a foundation in the genre as a whole. So, read your classics, get your Poe, your Dracula, your Frankenstein, probably touch on Richard Matheson, that kind of stuff, Algernon Blackwood, Shirley Jackson, 100%. But beyond that, I feel like once you kind of get a feel of where the genre has started, I think, it's been in
Yeah.
forms forever. Um, but once you kind of get those, early 20th century authors out of the way, you read them, you can kind of follow the threads that you really appreciate. For me, my personal favorites, the ones that I find really valuable as a writer, Brian Evanson, his collections, his use of literary minimalism in horror,
Mm.
and his very specific sense of the uncanny and the unsettling makes him one of my biggest influences. Same for Thomas Ligotti, though he has many different traits, but the fact that Ligotti's work is impossible to divorce from Ligotti himself and his
Mhm.
worldview, his philosophical pessimism, I think that's really important to me. And actually, like, it kind of made me, I think I spent a lot of my time before getting to the point of being published, doing a lot of Ligotti imitation. And
Mm,
what kind of made me kind of form the beginning of a paradigm time shift for me was, I paid for a critique from Nicole Cushing. She kind of asked a similar question, like, you
mhm,
know, what do you like? Who do you like? You know, what are you going for here? And I've dropped Ligotti, and she said, well, I mean, the world doesn't need another Ligotti.
mm.
They need a Carson, or, you know, whoever you are. And
Right.
I kind of put that in my head, and it made me think about, like, why do I actually like Ligotti so much? Because it's not just, you know, the the stories themselves, the style. There's more to it, and I think what really came to me is I like the fact that um Gotti's on every page of a Ligotti story. You
Mm.
can feel his presence. It's all him. Nobody else could write a Ligotti story but Ligotti, and it made me think a lot more about, like, okay, well, what do I bring to the table? Like, what makes me me? What, like, flights of whimsy that are so unique to my perspective as a person can I put into my fiction? And I really started thinking about that, and I felt like my ideas got more personal, but also more interesting after that. So I would challenge any writers to really think about, you know, what makes them unique, and really seriously think about it and try to, you know, write from that perspective. Don't try to be anyone else but yourself, as, you know, corny as it can be.
So you say that you've thought about what it would look like to have Carson Winter be on every page. What does I like? How would you explain what you are as a writer? I know how I would explain you as a writer, but like, what would you say?
Well, I think, you know, a lot of it comes, it's, my writing is often revolves around anxiety. I think it's typically pretty conversational, written in kind of a character's voice. I think there's usually a high concept, speculative fiction element at the
Mhm,
heart of the stories, that, you know, I think we're all just kind of an amalgam of our influences. And, you know, I like fun, entertaining reads, and I also like, you know, literary horror fiction, and I kind of meet them in the middle and come from, you know, the perspective of a unapologetically adult American, I guess. You know,
mhm.
somebody actually, I think it was Matt at Tenebrous, he said, Soft Targets is uh, the most American book we've ever published. And I was thinking about that. I was like, yeah, that's true. And I think that's something I navel gaze about a lot, is like, you know, I don't feel American. I'm not a flag waver. I'm not proud of being an American. And yet so many of my thought processes, actions, you know, are defined by the culture I grew up in. I am kind of an American, whether I want to be or not, just because of the culture that surrounds me. So I do think, a lot of my writing does have kind of an examination of American culture in it.
That makes perfect sense to me. And soft targets, of course, there's the examination of gun violence and workplace violence, but there's also so much of the narrative that is built on this principle we as Americans and as an American culture have bought into, and that is just this capitalist idea that your merit and your worth is determined by your output, right?
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, well, what happens if your output put can be ignored, right, on any
Hmm.
given day? And there's that part, like, even as I was reading it, so without really giving much away, there's days that Ollie, the roommate and best friend of the main narrator, takes off, and I remember being like, oh, he sounds like a loser. And it's like, why? Because he's taking days off from work. And I had to even like stop myself from just entering into that sort of perpetual myth
Hmm.
that we have built. And so I can see that playing. You're also really good at playing with that idea that all the things we think are fixed constants are really not, right? place, memory, identity, all of that is 100% up for grabs in the things I've read of yours. So I've read Reunion Special, I've read your piece in the Bloodlines book, and then I've read Soft Targets. And so maybe you don't do it in everything, but those three as a pattern, right? I'm like, oh yeah, what is time? What is
Yeah.
place? You know, are we in the past, present, or future? And that's also a really interesting element that is very specifically you
Oh
as a
yeah.
writer.
I totally see that. Yeah, thank you. Because it's so funny you mentioned that about Ollie and stuff, because that was kind of me coming to grips with like frustrations about my own coworkers. And
Yeah.
I kind of, at the time I wrote this, I worked at a grocery store, and I was struggling. I'd been there maybe like 8 years or something. I was either late 20s or just turned 30, and I was like, what the fuck am I doing with my life? I don't want to be here. I'm miserable every day. This doesn't mesh with who I saw myself as, which also made me do a bunch of navel gazing about like, my own internalized classism about like, why do I hate myself so much for working in a grocery store when it's a job like any other, and I shouldn't like. Do I also hold these feelings to my coworkers? And I realized,
Mm.
well, unfortunately, I kind of do, and I don't want to. Um, so I was thinking a lot about that, and that all like went straight into the book. Is like kind of me wrestling with being a an essential worker near the beginning of the pandemic, and not liking what I was doing, trying to figure out what I thought of myself and my job, and how um and also just kind of like that this was the image projected to everyone else in my life. So in a way, it's kind of funny now, because now I've been to school now. I work an office job now, and at the time when I was writing Soft Targets, the office setting was like, it was aspirational for me.
Mm.
I was like,
Interesting.
I was trying to distance it from my real job at the time, just because I didn't want to write a manifesto, essentially.
Right.
Yeah. And now I'm on the other end of it, where I'm like, oh man, do I want anyone at my current work to know about this book? Like, are they going to get it? Because now it like actually matches up too much to my real life.
Oh dear heavens. Yeah, that's actually, as I was reading it, I was wondering, like it's tricky to know when you're deciding to go places that horror has to go, right? That you're like, but really I'm a good person and I like kittens, but also read the darkness of my mind, and that's tricky with something like this, especially because it's first person narration and all of that.
And without a pen name too. So you're
Yeah.
really just like, I'm asking for it at this point, I think.
And I would assume, I mean, I've never known another Carson Winter. I don't know if you've like Googled, are there a lot of Carson Winter singular, no plural out there?
I haven't seen any. I
Okay.
haven't
Yeah.
noticed any. I think it's me.
Yeah. Yeah. That also, it's hard to be like, oh no, there's lots of us out
It's
there.
that other guy with a red beard.
That's right. I'm glad you talked about the quiet levels of horror and soft targets, because I think that's where it really doesn't pull its punches. I mean, there's a lot of really intense and dramatic things that happen, but the parts that disquieted me the most were just those dark places that we often find ourselves in and want to ignore. So this question, I'm going to try to keep it fairly spoiler free in how I ask it, but then you get to decide how many spoilers you're providing in the answer. And it's sort of like a two-parter of like, what was the greatest challenge in writing this novella, but also like, what do you feel is the biggest accomplishment that you're like, I did that, that like source of pride in finishing this particular work.
Okay. So I think the biggest challenge for me was, I think it was doing the kind of mental work beforehand of just kind of untangling the knots, examining what I was feeling, and being able to formulate those initial ideas and follow those kind of flights of fancy, and recognize those patterns in my life. The dark jokes at work, seeing the fucking little laminate they gave us at my grocery store that said, when a shooting happens, not if,
Oh my
when.
gosh.
Yeah. I was like, oh fuck, like I
It's
I was,
terrifying.
yeah, there's just all these little elements that I was I kind of look back and see like, baby Carson putting the pieces together, the early ideas forming, but I think it was just a lot of, mental work. But I think what I'm most proud of, and also one of the most difficult parts, to write a book that wasn't exploitative, that was a book about mass shootings, about violence, but didn't treat the violence itself as escapism. Um, One of my kind of mottos when I was writing it is like, no Tyler Durdens. That was what I was thinking of, because I think books, film, like Fight Club and stuff, I think are easy comparisons to make with what I was doing, because it's about, you know, angry middle class white guys interacting with their culture, being upset by capitalism and trying to find some kind of freedom through transgression. But I always felt a little, and for one, I loved Fight Club when I was a teenager, because I was a teenager.
Right.
I was a teenage boy, and that was a very cool movie for me when I was a teenage boy. But as I got older, I grew a lot more uncomfortable with it, I think. And it was mostly because of the way the movie, and maybe to a lesser extent the book, critique with the charisma of its character, Tyler Durden, which I think at the end, he's an outlet of escapism. You don't necessarily come away, fuck capitalism. You think more like, I wish I was Tyler Durden or something like that. So I was not writing any Tyler Durdens. I wanted my characters to be kind of the you'd work with, and that's kind of what that's what I was most proud of.
Yeah, that's great. And that actually sets me up nicely for my next question, because it was a bold, and I think correct move, but it was a bold move to write this particular story in first person, because there are multiple lines where your narrator is trying to get us to see Ollie as the bad guy, right? Like, this is all Ollie's fault. If he never would have told me about all of this, and where the novella ends up is a challenging place to be with a first person narrator, right? With someone that we're identifying with. So I guess there's part of this that I'm just curious to know why, especially with that in mind, you decided to go ahead and place this in a first person narrator. But also, what do you think is valuable or meaningful in a work of horror of having a first person narrator?
So for me, I think first person itself is it's almost impossible to separate from the horror genre in itself. I think he actually has some interesting things to say about that in his metafictional essay, Notes on a Horror Story, where he talks about a first person being the best mode to tell a horror story. But I also felt like, for me, like, I couldn't ignore the complicity in the narrative, that I didn't want to set these characters apart with distant third person would offer, because I feel like these characters are your average American. They're parts of me, but it would do them a disservice and the reader, I feel like, to ignore those. I think it just makes the book that much more punchier, readable, scarier to hear all of these horrible things said in a voice you recognize today.
That makes sense, and that's certainly the affect, right, in reading it, that it's very hard to not acknowledge those moments that we've all said things that it's like, should we, like, I have a tendency to be, someone will be like, how are you doing? I'm like, I just want to lay down and die. I don't really mean that at all, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's me being 100% dramatic, and also me being just like super dark person. What I really mean is I just want to close my eyes and take a nap, right? But like that language and, just the things that we casually say, right? When we think that there's no consequence, and then discovering, what that might look like in a world where consequence becomes a more fluid idea is really neat. And I think it worked well. I don't want to say that this wouldn't have worked if it hadn't been first person, but I don't think it would have had the impact. I think you made the right decision about that. For those of you that noticed a sort of weird moment where the video did things that you were not anticipating, if you're watching this in video form, and you may have seen the chat pop up, we were having some technical difficulties. That's why some of Carson's answers, and hopefully not mine, but it's possible my audio too, sound a bit repetitive, but I've tried to clean that up in post, and we've messed with things, and hopefully this will be better. But we appreciate all of you having that weird moment where we stopped recording, talked through our issues, and then came back, and hopefully, it has fixed itself. But Zoom is more or less where I hope your next horror will be, because I feel like it's like, is it real? Is it not? These are all the things you ask on a regular basis. Okay. When you're not writing and you're not working, you're not doing all the other things on your plate, what are you reading or watching, playing right now lately? Probably horror related, but if there's just something that you're like, no, everyone must play, Animal Crossing, then I'm happy to hear about that too.
Oh geez, man. Okay, so what I've been reading lately is I feel like since the pandemic happened, it killed my reading in a way. Like I was reading a fraction of what I did a year, and of course I think the yearly goals and stuff is a little bullshit, and it kind of it gamifies reading in a weird way. But I was like, I was kind of disappointed in myself. I was like, oh man, I'm not reading enough. But one of the things I think I've realized is that I just need to pick my books better. Because lately, I've really been enjoying reading again. It hasn't felt like a chore. I've read so many great books lately. One of the ones I read lately that was kind of just a weird curveball was the 1970s newspaper crime novel Fletch by Gregory MacDonald. A lot of people will know the adaptation with Chevy Chase in the 80s. And I enjoyed that. That was just like a wicked, smart, clippy crime novel. Just moving at a breakneck pace. I love that. And it also has just like great, minimalist writing, which I'm a huge fan of. I love great examples of good minimalism. I read Caleb Stevens' collection, If Only a Heart, and I really enjoyed that recently. Right now I'm reading Come With Me by Ronald Malfi. And that's my first book by him, but I am devouring it right now. It is so good. It's just like a page turning, I'd guess, like supernatural mystery thriller horror. I'm not far enough into it to really give it a genre, but I was reading it and I was just like, okay, I need to just gift myself more moments like this where I'm just reading something that just draws me in and compels me to read the next page. Because I feel like so often, especially in horror, which I call a very self-consciously literary genre, we feel kind of this urge, this social pressure, to read a lot of high-minded literary fiction, a lot of literary horror. I love literary horror, but the truth is that being literary just isn't good enough sometimes. Sometimes, we can't say all of it is good equally. Literary doesn't mean good, I guess is what I'm really trying to say. So it's just been so nice to kind of free myself from that kind of mental shackle of like, reading the thing that I feel like I'm supposed to read because it just came out. It's cool, whether I vibe with the author or not. And, just kind of going to the bookstore and finding something that looks real fucking cool and sitting down with it and like, laying with my cat and reading for a couple hours. It's been really nice.
I think that's particularly important in horror too. I have a very long, slightly complicated, probably incorrect theory about how, it's hard to do horror well in long form literature because most of the time we don't like characters, right? We're not in horror in a way that it's easier if it's a 90-minute thing. It's easier if it's a short story. But, there's a huge difference between reading Flannery O'Connor's short stories where you're like, yeah, everyone's human's terrible, and reading, which I've never managed to make myself do, her like novels where you're just like, we're still 200 pages into everyone being a terrible person. And I think that that's part of that literary horror instinct, right? Is that sometimes literary horror, like you're miserable during it, right? You're glad afterwards, but it can just feel overwhelming in a way that like I'm reading my way through Steve Alton's The Meg series. And
Okay.
every book is just like, look at the giant shark. And I'm like, yay, and sometimes it's just where I think, you want to be. And that's actually one of the things I really enjoy about the length of your works is that you don't feel the need to make it be a full length novel simply because that's how most of us read stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like I appreciate that you've really hit your stride and that novella length, which is where I think a lot of horror should be, right? Just enough for us to like know how dark things are, but not so much that 300 pages later we're still trying to make our way through these terrible people's lives.
For sure. And I love novellas. I think they're wonderful. And I even when I try to write a novel, my longest work to date that I just finished the other week, and I've been subbing out. It's my epic, and it's at like 54,000 words. It's still a really, really trim ass novel.
Yes.
I write lean. That's just kind of who I am. And another actually on short fiction, one thing I've really been enjoying is I just sat down the other day and I was going through Tenebrous Press's best of anthology, Brave New Weird, which I have a story in Haskins. I'm very proud that it got selected for this. But I was reading just some other authors' stories that I know and poking around. I gotta say, Warren Benedetto, he wrote just a fucking fantastic piece of short fiction called Blame. It blew my mind. It was so good. Also Luciano Morano also had a fantastic story in that. I've just cherry picked a little bit, but I think I'm going to actually settle in and just read the whole thing because they sold me. They sold me. They have great taste, obviously. Not just because I'm included.
Right.
But yeah.
It's only been recently that I've really begun to appreciate short stories. They're different, right? By the time sometimes I feel like by the time I get in, right, it's time to exit out. But I do feel like horror is in many ways meant, right, for some of these shorter form literary methods of communicating things, because then you have to sit there, right, quietly with your thoughts afterwards. And certainly you give us that. Okay. I feel like just in general as a horror writer, but I also feel like you, Carson, specifically, have to decide, what boundaries, what taboos, what limits you're willing to cross in your fiction. How do you make those hard decisions? And this, as I was typing this question, I realized it sounded judgy, but I wasn't meaning like, how do you make those decisions, Carson? But truly just like, how do you keep in mind where you need to go as a writer with what's going to make your readers be horrified and maybe in ways that are, past a point of no return?
I think it really all just comes down to having a good sense of authenticity. For me, like, there are boundaries I wouldn't cross, but they're pretty boring boundaries. They'd be like stuff like, I wouldn't feel comfortable telling someone else's story. I'm probably not going to write, a trans character specifically dealing with trans issues. That's not my story to tell.
Yeah.
I would represent a trans character and have them deal with issues that I know well, but I don't think it'd be fair to them or the audience for me to co-opt that story. And same for any marginalized group. That's something I wouldn't be willing to do. For me, I think that boundary is really just set by, does this experience come from within me? Does it feel honest to who I am? And that's really all it is. As far as like, the violence, the gore, the transgression, all of that, to me, that's just the window dressing. It all just has to come from a place of authenticity.
I think my students would benefit from hearing that answer, right? Because there's always that question that they ask at the start, which is like, what lines are off limits? And I joke and I'm like, tell them that I'm dead inside, so there's no lines they can cross that will offend me. But really, it's more that, right? Because I do say, but, right, you can't be harming bodies that are not your own simply for the sake of harming bodies that are not your own, right? And I think that's a lovely answer. Okay, you are publishing through a press whose name I still can't pronounce properly, and I'm not even going to try because I don't want Matt to judge me before I get him in an interview. But what inspired you to go ahead and make the decision to publish through a smaller indie press, not just once but multiple times, because you have the short story in the anthology, and you also have another work coming out down the line, like in September or October of 2023. So obviously something about this press is really working for you. Why go indie?
Well, I think for one, I kind of have to acknowledge that when you're kind of a smaller writer, there's not as much of a choice. So really, I consider myself lucky that I not only, got an indie publisher interested in this, but that I got the one that I did. Because I'm sure, everybody would love to go straight to fucking Penguin and get,
Sure.
a 6-figure deal. But the reality of writing is there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of voices, and you're dealing with kind of the subjective whims of an individual editor. So you have to go in and acknowledge the deck is stacked against you no matter what. That being said, what caught my eye about Tenebrous is that I thought they had a great aesthetic. They were really active on showing themselves on social media. They talked a lot about themselves, their values, their ideas. And also they branded themselves as a place that deals in new weird horror, which is exactly my genre. So here was a cool publisher with a great sense of values and ethics. And they published exactly the kind of shit I was writing. So I was like, oh, well, no fucking doubt, I'm going to submit to them. And as I was talking about earlier, I sent soft targets to them, and they rejected it. But it was the nicest rejection I've ever gotten. I talked with Alex Woodrow, the editor there, and she's just brilliant. She's great. And it was so overwhelmingly kind for them to give such transparency to me about the process, tell me exactly where I stood, offer advice on placing it other places, and just being there to talk about it, which you never expect that as a writer from someone who rejects you. You're trained to take the hit and move on. So it immediately came out that they were like lovely people to work with.
Yeah. And
down the road, they had another novella call, and I happened to have another novella, and I sent it to them. And also, I had another project co-written with Jolie Tumajon, which will be coming out in October, Post-Haste Manor. And they got back to me and were like, hey, is that soft target still available? And I was like, well, yeah. And I couldn't imagine having them on my radar now, seeing them market their books, seeing how they promote, seeing the obvious care they put into like the art. That's the other thing. Matt comes from like a comics background, so he's really clued into like visual art. He knows a lot of artists. He has like a vision that he wants to kind of put out there.
It's great.
And yeah, it's awesome. So they were like, hey, we'll take them all. And which was like probably the best possible outcome for me as a no-name writer, is they wanted it all, and I was happy to give it to them. And I couldn't be in better hands, honestly. I've loved every second of working with them.
And I won't lie, that the part of me that resonated with your answer about wanting to be able to taste what not anxiety feels like. Sometimes it can feel anxiety provoking for me, and I'm not even on the inside of just knowing how many voices we can now hear, right? Mm-hmm. But then on the other hand, how cool is it about how many voices we get to hear? Because, there are people like Matt and Alex who are going to do whatever it takes to make sure that we get to hear from not just the 4 people that occupy the horror bookshelf, right, at Barnes and Noble. And that's really neat. And that's exciting. It's exciting to see their lineup. They were kind enough to share with me, things so that I could see about arcs. And I was like, oh my gosh, The hardest part was I had to decide, like, I can't do them all because, you know, I should probably sleep at some point. But I mean, just reading them all, it just, and thinking about it as a collection, right? As what this press is putting out is really exciting too.
And that was the other thing is like talking with them, getting a sense, like I kind of felt like I was kind of lucking out here because I felt like I was seeing them before they were big. And I had a feeling they would get big just because of the care they put into their releases and that those would find an audience. And if you're going to tie your name to something, you can't tie it to anything better than something you think is going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. You get to have some say in the future and where we go next in the horror genre. What would be your answer? Where do you want us to go next? Or where do you think we're going that you're excited, right? If it's something that's happening now, but like what needs to be next for horror?
What I would really like to see would be an increase in weird fiction's mainstream presence. I think we're edging towards it. We're getting closer. I think there's weirder works out there that are gaining attention, especially in film. Sometimes it seems like they just exist to confound audiences. But
Yes.
I do see some kinship with a lot of the weird fiction I read. Movies like Skinamarink, I think, is super experimental, defiantly strange. It is proudly inaccessible. I love seeing stuff like that. But there's even stuff like Annihilation from years back. That's a high profile adaptation of a Vandermeer weird fiction novel. I think we'll hopefully see more projects like that coming out in the future, where weird fiction becomes a genre in and of itself, not just a small subsect of the horror genre.
Yeah. And this, I think of, which is not a horror film, but the film Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? And just how well that film has done in every realm, right? Like it's a critical darling. It seems to be a fan favorite. It was an amazing film. And I think you're right that if ever we're going to get there, now is sort of the time, because the times couldn't be weirder, right? Like we survived a global pandemic and now we act like it never even happened. If you wrote that in fiction, I'd be like, Carson, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. But we do live in these, I think, increasingly absurdist moments. And that would be exciting, I think, to see.
Yeah, I'm loving the absurdity that is coming into more mainstream productions. I think, going back to your earlier question, there's one thing I would describe myself, I'd say I write absurdist horror at its heart. And I love to see it because, there is so much about our reality that is absurd. And it doesn't take much exaggerating to get to that place.
No, a reunion special is another really good example, right? Where if you just describe the premise, it's about, reality TV, which just right there, you're like, no, reality TV is a real thing, and like we have these specials that but you keep reading and there's too much of your stories that are actually real, right? Like the things that are not real are just these tiny little parts sometimes. And that is where, for me, so much of the horror lies in your works, right? Because I'm like, haha, nope, actually been there, seen that, and I think that's really exciting to see how you do that. I won't lie, sometimes it's hard to read, for me to read a lot of weird and absurd horror because sometimes I just want brain candy, right? And that is never going to be brain candy. But when I'm ready to have my mind put into places that I may not recover from, that's a great place to go. So as you begin to continue inundating the horror genre, which is all things Carson, you can start making it more absurd. But what should people be excited for from you next? So you mentioned you have the Post Haste Manor, piece coming out. What else is in the chute?
Oh man. Okay, so I have an upcoming story coming out with Seize the Press, I believe in April, March or April. Soft Targets, of course, comes out March 22nd. I'm excited for people to read that. Post Haste Manor comes out in October, way out there, but that's a really weird fucking project. I hope people vibe
Excellent.
with. It's we barely even know what to call it. It's so weird.
I'm so excited.
I usually call it a shared collection. But yeah, it's co-written by Jolie Tumajon, and we just went wild. It was one of those projects just born out of like, hey, you seem cool. Do you want to work together?
That's
And then
great.
we just, threw some DMs at each other and we're like, yeah, let's write something about like the rise and fall of some haunted house.
Oh,
And
that's
then
cool.
we, there's 10 short stories, very short stories, 2,000 words each, and then a co-written novella from two different protagonists that kind of interact and intersect through time and space. And it is
Oh,
truly us just letting our hair down and getting weird, which is very exciting. Otherwise, those are the major projects I have coming. There's some that I can't quite reveal yet, and there's
sure.
probably I do have a very weird kaiju story coming out in the Monster Layers anthology through Dark Matter, edited by Anna Madden, I believe. And that'll be pretty cool if you like post-apocalyptic serial killer wizards hiding in the bones of a kaiju.
As one does, right?
If that's like your specific vibe, you're gonna love this story.
Yeah, I was actually, when you said that it's weird, and I was like, okay, if Carson has a meter where like normal is already probably weird, how weird does weird have to be? But then you answered it, so
Yeah.
that sounds exciting. And of course, like you said, you're always writing and working on more stuff. In fact, I'm going to interview you and Jolie in sometime in September, because I'm really excited to read
I'm excited for
that
that. It'll be
particular
fun.
work. And like I said, the list of the things that are coming out are just phenomenal. And it was really a matter of like having to pick and choose which ones I had time for. So people should definitely, you said that they have a site, right?
Yes.
Because they, okay.
Tenebrouspress.com, I believe.
Okay. Because they are not giving money to our capital overlords. Okay. That's as it should be.
And their books look gorgeous too. Like everyone should just go and look. Even if you don't want to buy anything, look at their books. They are gorgeous books.
And do they sell physical copies, or they mainly do? Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm. We have a special. It won't be out by when this airs, but right now we are doing a special pre-order bundle for Soft Targets that has like a coffee mug that you'd see at a workplace, a shirt with like a printer going through the window, and a special edition of the book, the physical book that will be signed by me. But by the time this is out, there'll be the book only pre-orders coming out. And those will be very cool too. And I hope people really enjoy them, because the art is by Blackie Shepherd, who's a comics artist in the Pacific Northwest, and it is just awesome art. You couldn't hope as a writer for like a better cover.
Yeah, it's a really pretty cover, and it's nice to have it be in physical form, right? Sometimes that's the hardship of doing indie or self-publishing, right? Is like you can't have that thing that you can just cling to for better or worse.
An object makes it feel real. You got to hold it in your hands. It's the result of all the labor and the thinking and the stress of submitting and wondering like, oh, is this ever gonna sell anywhere? Which was actually the funniest part about this book, that it would be like really my like indie press debut. This is like the first book I've had a publisher with that's just my name on the cover. It's just me. It's a Carson Winter book. And it was the one that I would always joke like, oh yeah, I'm never gonna fucking sell this one.
Yeah, that does feel Well, very weird, right? That does feel like, again, it's the premise to the next book. At some point, I hope there'll be a book that's about an indie horror writer named like Warson Kinter or something like that, right? And you'll just kind of like show us, and we'll be like, no, that's not real. And you're like, this was my yesterday.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Carson. It's such a delight getting to talk to you, as it is every time I get the privilege of talking with you. And thank you for also writing the stuff that I get to read. It's really good. So for those of you listening to this episode, if I've timed things correctly, it's coming out before Soft Targets will be released, so that you have time not to get this super cool bundle, but to definitely get your copy of the book. And you should, because if any of the things that you've heard today make you sound, get you excited, Soft Targets is for you. It's not maybe for everyone, but it's for you, whoever you are. And thank you so much, Carson. This has really been lovely.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. You always ask such thoughtful questions, and it makes me live out my writer fantasy of being able to talk about my work with someone who's engaged with it on such an intellectual level. So thank you.
Absolutely. And to all of you listening, thank you so much for listening to our nightmares, and have a spooktacular day. Carson Winter is a minimalist weirdo, a conversational absurdist, and a vehemently bleak-minded artist making his home in the Pacific Northwest. His fiction has appeared in Vastarian, Apex, and Dreadstone Press's Split Scream series. His novella Soft Targets is available now through Tenebrous Press. You can find Carson on Twitter at CarsonWinter3 or at his website, carsonwinter.com.